Here's a question for you. Which of these three is the most serious problem today? Smoking, alcohol, or obesity? Well, we just asked that of the American public, asked them to rate the seriousness of each of those three, and obesity comes out on top. Look at these numbers there. 81% of Americans say that obesity is an extremely or very serious problem. 67% say that about smoking, and less than half, 47%, say that drinking or alcohol is an extremely or serious problem for Americans. Now, we also ask Americans whether or not the government should be involved in setting up programs to deal with these issues. Here we find across the board Americans score lower. In other words, they're not as interested or don't think it's as important that the government get involved as they do that it is a serious problem. For example, look at obesity. Remember, 81% of Americans said that was an extremely or very serious problem, but only 57% say that it is extremely or very important that the government set up programs to deal with obesity. So there's a gulf there between the seriousness and the importance. And we find the same things on cigarettes and on drinking, although drinking's about the same. But for cigarettes, we find fewer Americans say it's important for the government to get involved than say it's a serious problem. Now, a lot of this is being driven by Republicans. When we look inside the data here, as my colleague Elizabeth Mendez has done recently, she found that it was Republicans who are very strongly against government programs, and that's what tends to make those numbers about the importance of the government getting involved lower than perception of the seriousness. By the way, people ask us how many people indulge in these habits. Well, let's look at the numbers here. Smoking, 20% of American adults, that is those 18 plus, say that they smoke cigarettes. That's been about where it's been for the last several years, but clearly down from the high point in Gallup history, which was 45% of adults who smoked back in 1954. What percent of Americans drink alcohol? 2/3, 66%. That means that about 1/3 of Americans are what we used to call down in the South teetotalers. They never drink alcohol. By the way, 22% of Americans say they sometimes drink more than they should, so that's the percent of Americans who think that's a problem. Finally, what about overweight? Well, this is really interesting because when you compute BMIs, body mass indices, either whether we do it at Gallup or the government does it, you find way over half of Americans who are overweight. But when we ask the public, do you consider yourself to be overweight? The number is 41%. All the rest of Americans say that they think their weight is about right, or actually a small percent say they are underweight. So we've just got about 4 in 10 Americans who will admit to being overweight, which is probably a misattribution to their own problem because, again, the government shows us that a significantly higher percent are overweight based on computations of BMI. So there you have it, a look at what Americans think about these three potential problems and what percent of Americans engage in each of these habits. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.